this episode of Money and You, we're discussing the topic of economic harm. Now, we will be getting into some topics that are quite sensitive and might be a bit triggering for some people. We will be touching on where you can go to get support if you or someone you know is experiencing economic harm. And some of our guests today will be sharing their perspectives on how to navigate some of these situations. But if you do think that this topic may be particularly triggering for you, I just recommend that you step away, maybe take a look at some of our other episodes, and then come back to this one when and if you feel you're in the headspace to take in the discussion. So I'll just get that disclaimer out of the way up front. But now I'm really excited to introduce the guests for this episode who are all doing some incredible work in this space. So we've got Dr. Ayesha Scott from Auckland University of Technology, Angela Smart from MoneyTalks, Nicola Eccleton from Good Shepherd, and Martin King from BNZ. So we'll hear a little bit more about what each of you are doing shortly. I just wanted to start this discussion off. So it's obviously a very, tricky subject, a bit of a dark side to it, obviously. But I wanted to start by looking at what does a healthy financial relationship look like between two people? I know it's, we're not talking about an ideal, perfect relationship, but what does a reasonably good one look like? Whoever wants to jump in can kick things off.
The million-dollar question, Clarissa, what does a good relationship look like? I think from my perspective, if you take the financial out of that, it's what any healthy relationship looks like. It's about trust, it's communication, it's about partnership, participation, having choice and agency to make decisions.
Yeah, and I'd probably add to that it's, it's not necessarily, unicorns and rainbows. It's not going to be happy all the time. But when conflict does arise, those conversations can happen in an open and loving way without sort of descending into blame or being mean or particularly emotive or particularly angry. So it's just about being comfortable to disagree and to have arguments and to have those tough conversations, but still come out the other side of that, knowing that you're supported and you're loved and you can, work together as partners. I think that that's key to any healthy relationship, as Nicola said, but I think around money in particular, we don't necessarily do these things particularly well.
Yeah, I tend to agree that being able to have a conversation about finances without fear, without hiding stuff, that's when you start to understand that maybe there's a little bit of disharmony in regards to a relationship and being able to share your finances, but to be able to have those discussions without fear of retribution, of bringing, the difficult stuff up.
I guess the final point I'd make is that the role money actually has within relationships. So if you think about the core things around a relationship, a roof over your head, enough food on the table, paying the bills, having an enjoyment life, the one commonality between all of those is actually the ability to pay for it. And how do you structure that? So I think there's a danger sometimes that we think money, economics are very separate to the rest of relationships, but actually there's a higher level of the core parts of us as being human beings now that relies particularly on banking, finances, and the money that goes around.
Okay, so now that we've established what a reasonably good financial relationship looks like, let's turn to, what a harmful or potentially abusive financial relationship would look like. And when it comes to this, I'm going to use the term economic harm, but I'm interested. I know there are a lot of terms sort of that are used. So, financial harm or financial abuse. Are we essentially talking about the same thing with all these terms, or is there a spectrum when it comes to that?
So I think I can dive in here. So yes, it it exists on a spectrum. So the way that I look at it in my research is on one side, of the spectrum, we have the healthy financial relationship that we were just all discussing. And right down the other end, we have dynamics that you would consider to be extreme violence. So we know that for people experiencing abuse and violence of various different forms, a very, very high proportion of those victim survivors of other forms of violence, physical, sexual violence, also experience economic and financial abuse alongside. So that would be the other end of the spectrum. And then in the middle, you have what I would think of as economic and financial abuse, and we can define that in a moment. And then more in that grey area between the abuse and the healthy financial relationship, I think you've got these harmful behaviours. And I think it's really today what we'll speak to is economic and financial harm is really this grey area that sits between having a perfectly healthy financial relationship and a normal relationship that that many of us would be in, but also really trying to talk about some of those behaviours that are abusive and that cause harm. And I think, and again, Nicola will speak to economic harm as the term that we use, but equally economic abuse, financial abuse, and then for me, like extreme violence right down the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, so in terms of the economic versus the financial, from my perspective, the economic feels like a little bit broader. So we're acknowledging that some of what goes on is about stopping people from getting to employment. So sabotaging someone getting to work so they can't be financially independent. So for me, that's why economic is a broader term. And the harm is, we've actually just written a blog on this on our website because it's a really interesting talking point. The harm is about reaching people and helping people identify. So abuse is a real blockage because it speaks to violence and it speaks to the extreme end of the spectrum, whereas harm is a little bit more, you can actually behave in a way that you think is quite acceptable but cause harm. So it's about being able to reach people who both are victims of harm, but also who are perpetrating that harm, so that we can start to take away a little bit of those, the stigma or the barriers to getting support and making the behaviour change.
That's a really interesting point, actually, because that's something that I guess you touched on. It can be unintentional, would you say, in some cases, not always this conscious harm being inflicted.
I think for relationships, there's some stuff around habits. So we form habits and we fall into roles in relationships, and the more years that go on, the more we fall into these roles. And I think we have some of the things that we have seen that have caused harm have come from quite a paternalistic place of wanting to look after people. But I wanted my wife to be able to stay home and look after the kids if she wanted to. I wanted her not to have to make those hard decisions around finances. And it's actually become the wife, it can happen to both women and men and in all sorts of situations. But the person who's staying at home finds that all of a sudden they don't have the confidence or the ability, and it's become, I don't have a say in these things.
Right. That's really, really interesting. So I guess I'm curious to know, and perhaps Angela, you might be able to speak to some of this. How would I be able to tell if I was experiencing something like this on any end of the spectrum, or someone I knew was experiencing it? What kind of signs should I be looking for that would tell me that I wasn't in a healthy financial relationship?
I think, I guess based on, the phone calls that we get at Money Talks, it's a conversation around, feeling comfortable and being able to have those conversations. If you feel that something is off or that you can't go and do something because somebody says, that that's not appropriate, or that you're not allowed to, or it's my money, that, having those conversations, hearing the terminology that's used. But a lot of the time, I think it happens without any real idea, that you don't even know that it's happening. Like, it's amazing how many years on, having people call us saying, but so and so put my name on their loan, but he's the one that drives the car, or those kind of conversations, that I think a lot of it happens so subtly that unless that you are really in a space of looking out for it, I'm not quite sure if it's necessarily something that can be pinpointed as such, but it becomes an overarching theme potentially within the relationship. And money doesn't happen in a silo. It's not just, finances is the only thing that's going wrong, that there'll be other things that'll be, from an emotional perspective that, to be watching out for.
Sure. And just to build on that, I think that one of the things we observe and have observed is just general asymmetry. So asymmetry in knowledge, asymmetry in capability, access. Sometimes, again, some of those unintended consequences are asymmetry in income that drives certain behaviours. But it's when some of those asymmetries work in opposites. So to Angela's point, can you have the car loan in your name, but I drive the car and I have the higher income? Some of those asymmetries, I use it more, I earn more money, but can you have the debt? Those are the ones where you start to add up on the great ledgers of life around what sits on one side and what sits on the other. And as you start to, and it's quite difficult because it will be not one big thing. And I think there's a danger sometimes we say there'll be an event and there'll be a big thing. And I think some of what Nicola and Ayesha have already talked to it is a build-up of a series of small points that add up to, actually, this is a picture of increased asymmetry, and it will be unwitting. It won't, the word malicious will not always be in there, but sometimes we've got to be careful that doesn't then bleed into malicious calculated. Because I think at the other end, going to Ayesha's point about towards the violence end, when this becomes incredibly tough and hard is where you have coercion around violence and money. So if you don't do this financial transaction in a certain way, there will be a physical consequence to that. And that's the combining of the two worlds of physical violence and financial violence that then becomes incredibly, because you're then tied into contracts. And that's the other part that I guess doesn't happen in certain other parts of unhealthy relationships, is these become financial contracts between you and a financial service provider, which are held up in law. So I think, I'll come back to that, asymmetry is a key thing to look out for.
Nicola or Ayesha, anything to add to that?
What I would add to that is that when we did our research, we found that there's also a blurry line between using money as a form of control and then economic harm being a result of family violence, and people saying, I can't leave my physically violent relationship because I don't have any financial support or capability, or so I'm stuck in this place where I can't go and become safe because of the financial situation.
Yeah, and I suppose I would add, and we've all sort of spoken to this a little bit, but no one goes into a relationship and an intimate partnership, from a place of, well, what's this going to look like when this all goes pear-shaped? What is this going to look like when inevitably, we break up and we have to split relationship property? And so the way that we tend to, join finances and the way that we tend to develop these financial relationships, it is that real gradual progression that Martin spoke to. But the one thing, and I suppose the way that I think about it, is it's a gradual erosion of confidence and capability, and a slow squeezing and restriction freedoms that you enjoyed beforehand, you know, and you wake up one day and you go, actually, hang on, I used to do that. I used to handle these things, and now I'm not, and I'm afraid to. Or, you know, as Martin spoke to, there might be a real physical consequence, or even the threat of a consequence is extremely powerful. In my research, I spoke to a woman who said her partner just put a knife, just a sharp kitchen knife, on the windowsill, and she asked him to move it because they had little kids, and he just said, yeah, I will, and he just didn't. All it was a knife. Now, because of the situation and the trap that she was experiencing at that point, and this was extreme economic and financial violence, you know, she didn't feel comfortable moving that knife. He didn't move that knife for some time, and he didn't lay a hand on her. He wasn't, you know, telling her that she couldn't go out and buy a new knife, you know, because this one's sitting on the windowsill. It doesn't look like, it can be the smallest thing that has, you know, such a powerful hold. And, you know, coerced debt, you don't blink an eye when you say, well, we're in a partnership together, and, you know, one partner needs to buy a new car, and it just makes sense in the moment that, oh, okay, that loan will be in my name, because you're both paying it off together. But there is that asymmetry there, and that power dynamic is really, really important. For one couple, sharing debt and income and managing spending, you know, via two independent accounts probably makes total sense. You know, one partner is paying for everything and the other partner is managing the investments, and it's that real partnership and the agency around that. And then that same dynamic without the agency, that's abuse and that's harm. And I think that it's really, it is tricky to think about, you know, and it suffers an awareness problem as well, which is why we're all sitting here talking today.
Now, Ayesha, the example that you used just before was with a relationship between a woman and a man, in which the woman was the one being abused. And I'm just wondering, is that typical in Aotearoa New Zealand? Is there a particular group of people, whether it's a certain age group or gender or demographic, that is more vulnerable to experiencing economic harm or abuse?
So in my research, we predominantly look at economic harm as violence against women. Now, this is statistically predominantly how it presents. However, what I will say is it can happen to anyone in any type of relationship. You know, and Martin will speak to this as well, probably from experience at the bank, but it's predominantly male violence against women. However, that is not 100% of the time. And what I would also say is there hasn't been enough research done on other types of relationships, and there hasn't been enough research done you know, on different dynamics. The other thing I would say is that what we've spoken to so far is you know, intimate partner economic harm between two romantic partners. Angela was speaking a little bit before we started recording about elder abuse and financial abuse of an older person, and what we find is that the dynamic, I suppose, there is quite different. So we think about economic harm as being restriction of economic resources, exploitation or sabotage. I would say from an elder abuse perspective that you're really looking at exploitation. There's a restriction of things there as well, but it's a much more exploitative relationship, whereas with romantic partners, the motivations for that and the dynamic is quite different. But going back to your question, it's predominantly male violence against women, but it can happen to anyone. And age, class, socioeconomic status, education, some of these are risk factors, some of them are consequences of, but it can happen to anyone, and it's often not who you think it will be.
And probably to build on that, Ayesha, I would say in terms of, so we have at BNZ a particular support team that has been set up with specially trained individuals that support victims, survivors of economic harm. And I think everything you just said there is exactly as we see play out. So at the moment, we're seeing a predominantly heterosexual relationships with victim, survivor, the female within that. But certainly from experience, not just within Aotearoa New Zealand, but also in other countries, when you start to get into same-sex relationships, but also the converse of male victim survivors, a female victim survivor, again, the asymmetries and the dynamics, where there is less physical violence involved sometimes, the less the physical power play, actually money is an incredibly powerful tool to maintain coercion and control. And I would also reflect upon location, demographic in terms of finances, demographic in terms of culture, race. No one wins. So there's nobody that's escaping from this, all the way from what we describe right at the top of the house, what we would describe as the affluent parts of New Zealand, all the way through to the less affluent parts. The dynamics, as Ayesha says, are very different. What can be controlled, what can be sabotaged, and what can be limited are different, but they all exist. They all definitely happen in everywhere that we look.
And there's some really, Good Shepherd comes at it from a family violence perspective, and there's some really obvious reasons for why it's gendered, and that's because women have not had the same economic security that men have had for all of those traditional patriarchal reasons. So as Martin said, it's asymmetry, it's power, the person with the more money. So some quite obvious links there.
Can I also add to not forget about people with disabilities and mental health conditions as well? You know, we get a number of phone calls where, once again, you know, like Martin was talking about, the asymmetry, but in a way where you then have the issue of mental capacity and being able to be able to spot it. And, you know, we're starting to see a rise in those kind of conversations about people who get a hold of people's FPOS cards because they've lent them to go off and, you know, go get groceries. But from a carer perspective or a family perspective, that's starting to be seen within our helpline as well.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Angela, just you mentioned mental health. And so I just wanted to ask, because obviously there's an impact of this behavior on the person who's experiencing it, right? And I'm assuming that, you know, this can have some pretty serious consequences for someone's mental health and just overall sense of happiness and well-being. Like what have you experienced in the people that you've spoken to and people that your team has spoken with? How does it actually impact on people?
Funny you should say this. Like, we've only been having a discussion within the team in the last 24 hours about how the helpline is almost changing more from just simply being a catch net of being able to point people in the right direction of where to go for financial help and understanding these areas, to becoming almost like a counselling session within itself to start off with, because the sheer pain, the anguish of knowing that, they can't see a way out of it at this point from a financial perspective. And then you add the layers of understanding or thinking, well, hold on, maybe my partner's doing this to me, or maybe my son is doing this to me from an elder abuse perspective. You know, you've got layers of emotions, layers of trauma there, and so for us, that's when we're able to use the networks that we have available to us to be able to help people. But for sure, you're getting people who have plucked up the courage to be able to even call and reach out for help, to then have that real responsibility of being able to help move them to the next person that's going to be able to provide that wraparound service. But for sure, emotionally, just massive.
And Angela, I think we see very similar. So in terms of the kind of conversations, and one of the other things I would certainly reflect upon is the extent to which the harm continues once the relationship is ended.
Yes.
And that is within, and that's I guess where some of the differences will feature to other types of harm, is whether it's the family relationship. The family relationship may have ended. You may have the estranged member of the family, but the financial harm will potentially stay for many years. Bad credit ratings, coerced debt. They don't get clicked off as soon as you walk out, or indeed the other individual leaves. So there's a danger actually. We assume that once decisions have been made to safely close or end the relationship, that all of this stuff actually finishes, and potentially it's actually when it begins, and the harms that are experienced don't actually really come to the fruition until you begin on your own. So your ability to rehouse yourself may be impacted by the decisions or indeed coercion that's happened to you. The ability to continue your so again, some of the core things that we count: our lifestyle, our ability to ensure our children have the lifestyle that they have become born into and enjoy. And that's, I think, where certainly the differences within some of the economic layers within the country, it is very, very different. But actually the harm and coercion sometimes actually becomes even more difficult. So I'll give you an example. If I leave the relationship, can my children continue to receive the best education that they are receiving at the moment? So can I move? And actually it flips on to another level, but again, the money, the finances, the housing sits at the heart of that.
Martin, can I also just ask you about the work that you've been doing at BNZ with regards to transaction abuse? Because there were some really interesting findings. Was it something like there were 10,000 transactions over a 6-month period or something like that were quite abusive, and not all of them initially looked to be abusive, but when you sort of delve deeper, it sort of revealed a bigger picture. Could you talk a bit about that? Because I think that's really something that certainly I had never thought about before.
Yeah, happy to. And actually, probably I could take the rest of this session to kind of explain it. But and we certainly would say at BNZ, we looked around, and we do continually look beyond the shores of the country to look at what's happening internationally. We noticed a number of banks were starting to look at. We do 3 things core as a bank. We lend money, we allow people to deposit money, and we also do payments. And actually what increasingly banks were seeing around is payments are becoming far easier, far more digital. And actually I can do them in a very private way. I could sit here now and make a payment and still be doing this podcast. But actually what I choose to use that payment for could be paying my rent, it could be paying a friend, but actually the ability to write a message becomes an interesting tool, no different to a mobile phone text message or WhatsApp, and also potentially comes at a lower cost, bizarrely, because what you're choosing to use instead of the telecoms cables, that's very old fashioned, but the mobile phone waves, what we're actually starting to use is the bank's payment systems. And payment systems that have been set up to do certain things. So when we actually started to delve into what kind of payments are we seeing going and coming, we came across 7,000 that you would describe as undesirable, I will go with. Okay, whether that's language, I could have a very jokey relationship with an individual and use some pretty horrific language. that some people may determine as that's banter. Some people may determine that actually that's not particularly pleasant. And that's at one end of the scale. So that was kind of one case we saw. Another case we saw was conversations between people. It's actually very cheap and very hidden for me to have a conversation with Nicola instead of having it over text messages where my mobile phone may be taken from me by law enforcement. They didn't necessarily think to go and have a look at bank statements, and we observed some interesting behaviours there. And then the final one, and the one that was more of concern, and it's actually really difficult to detect, is where those payments are being used to maintain harm or actually elicit harm. And we had two cases I remember very well. One was when an individual had spent $2.91 sending 40 messages over a 6-month period, pleading with their ex-partner, but going through the full cycle of abuse. So pleading, blaming, shaming, but you doing that on their bank statement. And 40 messages and not one swear word was used. So again, going back to the horrific language, you would not be able to find that, but it was a pattern of behavior, low value, high volume over a short period of time between two people. And the other person didn't even bank with it. We can see the money leak. And the other case was where 1 cent was sent every working day for 4 years with a particularly undesirable phrase in there that I wouldn't repeat here. And this is a repeatable pattern. So it doesn't cost much, but where it shows up. So again, if we talk about it's horrible to receive. It's horrible to have that and to deal with the trauma of that day. The next time you need to go in to apply for a mortgage, a home loan, get some validation, you have to produce a really important document, which is normally your bank statement. So that shame is then continued when you go to apply. And actually, how are you going to have in front of you the bank manager reading this bank statement with this kind of language on it? So you choose to face into that shame, which is really hard, or you don't face into those bigger financial decisions. Again, you may need to go and receive some support from the government through work and income. Again, do I want work and income seeing this kind of language? So I think that there's a multi-layer and again, an extended period of harm. And what we've said at BNZ is, first of all, we know that you're doing this. So just to be really clear, it's unacceptable. And if customers either one, recognise it themselves and wish to highlight, we will take action. And for those people that are doing this, we have contacted and said, please stop. And if that doesn't continue, it does continue, we will actually end our relationships with those customers, because this is not what that process is meant for. And this is about moving money around.
Wow, I'm really fascinated by this, and I've got so many more questions for you. But yeah, I guess you started to touch on what you at BNZ are actually doing to kind of combat some of this and hold people accountable. And so I'm thinking we might just move along now to, we've covered sort of what economic harm and abuse can look like and the sorts of people that it can affect. And I'm wondering now if we could talk about what to do once you perhaps recognise that you are a victim of economic harm, or someone is seeing those signs. Where can you go to get support and help? Because surely it's something that I guess many people might consider as a hopeless situation in many instances, particularly if, as you've all talked about, there's all these other factors at play. Where does someone even start if they're sort of looking for help?
One of the things that we've all probably identified is that there has traditionally been a real gap in this space. And so we're just starting to see some responses like the BNZ's response that they've been working on. We're currently recruiting for a specialist financial wellbeing coach of economic harm. We have been trialling a little bit with some of our debt coaches, but during that trial, we established that actually someone needs to be a specialist in this space and really understand it. Some people we would encourage to go and speak to a family violence agency, because there may be other forms of violence happening alongside, and it's really important that if that is the case, that they are able to access support from a family violence agency. I think that's a bit of a starting point, but we feel quite passionately that workforces across the board actually need to be upskilled in how they might respond. So whether that's banks, whether that's telcos, whether that's utility companies, there's everyone potentially has a very small role to play in making people's lives easier and providing some support. So I think that's still a work in progress, and I'm really excited for it to build over the next few years.
And I would probably just add, Nicola, I think that there's a lot of online resources. And I think also, as you talk about the build and the, I describe as the opening of Pandora's box, we've got to be very clear, this is not a new thing. This is not something that's happened just in the last couple of years. But actually what's happened is we've decided that a number of people are deciding to open up Pandora's box. So this is financial abuse is not a 21st century thing. It's not a 20th century thing. And this is a long thing, but actually we've got to face into it. So I think internationally, some of the research has skipped ahead. So there is lots. There's lots you can find. There's lots of support and direction. And I probably would agree with Nicola around actually seeking support. It is very often this won't operate within an isolated silo. There will be other support and other people that actually can sit out there for you. But also I think we as at BNZ, we are facing into it, but it is really tough. And I don't want to assume to sit here and say for other businesses or for individuals that we'll get this nailed overnight. But I think actually to suggest that we will have 100% support on day one would actually be very foolhardy. This is about us facing into an issue, helping our people recognise those signs, recognise those things that aren't great, the asymmetry, but also know that there are people out there that will support you. And I think the work that Good Shepherd do, the research that you're leading on, Ayesha, and the work that MoneyTalks does, not just in a financial abuse, but in a more broader sense, is very much about being there for the difficult times in your life. And that may be this. There also there's a whole raft of other topics. And again, I don't want us to sit here and consider that it's one circle of financial abuse. We can get a big Venn diagram and it starts to look a bit messy, but it doesn't operate in one silo.
I absolutely agree with Martin. And I guess, the way MoneyTalks, our ability to help is to be able to have that conversation in a private and confidential way. We have a number of different ways that people can reach out. If they don't feel like they can have a conversation on the phone because someone's listening, we've got the ability to do web chats, and there is a trained financial mentor at the other end that has the ability to have conversations without people overhearing. You can contact us by email, by text. So there's a number of different ways that we can offer that, which then we hook you up with a local financial mentor, so somebody that's in your area or somebody that is specifically, can speak, your language. There's so many layers of things, because once you start looking outside that, there's more to it than just money. But how do you, if somebody's taken that amazing step to even be able to notice it, reach out, have a conversation, it's up to us to be able to provide the spaces and the places for them to be able to go. And I guess that's where, from Money Talk and FinCap's perspective, working with, there's over 200 different budgeting services around Aotearoa that has the ability to be able to work with people, whether it's through online and that type of stuff. So it's about being able to look at each situation, but to be able to take that first step to reach out is by far, it's all props to people to be able to do that, because that would be the scariest thing ever.
What do we do then so obviously we've talked about what people can do to reach out for support when it, gets to that point where they've recognized something's going wrong, something's not right, I need some help. Ayesha, I might ask you this question. Is there any way we could people could almost proactively prevent this from happening sort of before it gets to that point? Is there some kind of, the role of, financial literacy and improving your knowledge of how this sort of stuff works? Is that something that could help people not experience this from the start?
Yeah, so if I think about prevention, I think that, we put a lot of responsibility on a victim survivor to keep themselves safe. We then blame them for the abuse, and historically this has been overwhelmingly the case. So, what did you do that provoked this individual to cause you harm? And we don't make it particularly easy for victim survivors to, seek help. And this is changing, but there's still a lot more work that needs to be done in this space. So I think from a prevention point of view, everyone, this is everybody's problem. This is not a women's issue. This is, not a men's issue. This is everybody's problem. And I think that if we all just tried to be a little bit more open and a little bit more constructive in our own intimate relationships, if it's safe to do so, but equally look at friends and family. It's not something that needs to be behind closed doors. If you think that something's off because of the way that a close friend is behaving, then ask the question. And you might they might say, oh no, there's nothing to see here, thanks. But by asking that question, you've let that victim survivor know that actually, if they do need to disclose to you, or they become ready to disclose to you, then you're probably going to be someone who is a safe place for them to do that. And research shows that, those social interactions and those social reactions that victim survivors receive when they make disclosures, like the difference in, their mental well-being and their overall outcomes, it's just so much more positive for them to, feel that they've been heard, feel that they're not being misbelieved, they're understood and their experience, is important and is valid. And then, partnering with them to do the hard things, because it is a hard thing to call a helpline and talk about your financial situation. It is a hard thing to call your bank and realize, actually, I have a lot of coerced debt and I'm not entirely sure how I'm ever going to, get out of this. And for many victim survivors, ending that relationship takes intense planning. And that is true of someone facing down the extreme end of the violence spectrum through to, the less traditionally violent, but equally harmful economic harm perspective. We talk about financial capability in this space, and there has been work done, particularly in the US. Financial empowerment of victim survivors is a key intervention. And I'd make 2 points on that. Is usually it's not a question of financial capability. There might be some missing financial knowledge, but broadly, a victim survivor has done an awful lot with very little over an extended period of time. A victim survivor may not pass a financial literacy exam, but will be extremely financially capable. The question is really about confidence. And so how can we build confidence for a victim survivor so that they take back control? Because it's all about control. They haven't had it. So how can we give some control back so, they can navigate their financial future? Because it is challenging. And as Martin said, this is not a new problem, but it suffers a massive awareness issue. So let's name it, let's talk about it, and let's start solving it. But it is everybody's problem, and we are all responsible for keeping everyone in our society safe.
I don't think we can underestimate the visibility and awareness piece and how important that is. And it requires repeated effort. And we look at the It's Not Okay campaign and what that has done for physical violence. And we've really changed the conversation from what happens in a marriage is none of our business to actually that's never okay, no matter if people are married or not. And I think that we have roles as employers to say we've got an example of an employer where someone didn't have access to their wages. So as employers, we can be saying, this is your bank account where you complete the form. Our expectation is that you have access to this money or you have control over where this money goes. We can be talking to our customers and saying you're signing a bank loan with your partner or you're taking out a mortgage with your partner. Did you want to see some of the resources that are available on getting joint debt and having conversations with your partner about money and planning together and taking on these joint financial decisions that you're making? So if those sort of things are flagged at all sorts of different touch points, that actually there's an expectation that there are some standards of behavior, and fundamentally this is against economic harm, is against the law. It's actually illegal for people to behave in this way and use money as a form of control. So that's our starting point. And so if at each of those different areas, and you log into your bank and you log in somewhere else, and then you see an ad for MoneyTalks and people are saying, hey, talk to your partner, do you have a say? We will start chipping away at the problem. I think awareness just can't be underestimated, the power of it.
And just to build on that, Nicola, I guess I'd encourage organisations, and you touched upon giving people an understanding where the asymmetries may exist in those interactions you have with financial services, your employer, where your employer may actually be able to help you out. We've come across cases, and this is probably more in passing, but people pay more on their gas bill or their electricity bill because that's the safe place they can build up a fund of money. So people will find a way, and so they'll overpay their electricity bill by $10 a week every year. Do you know what? They've got $500 that their partner is, their potentially abusive partner is unaware of, and actually they've been maintaining what they need to do. On the other side, is I guess understanding us as banks and as other companies, the strength of controls around privacy, around making sure that everybody understands fully what contract they're entering into, and they have enough agency with which to make that decision. And that sounds really simple. And the words, no, my wife or my husband understands everything, it's okay. The rules and regulations, again, are there for a reason. But be wary. Again, the wonderful part about working in financial services is you have relationships for sometimes 25, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years with your customers. But that comes with an extra responsibility that you have a relationship with your customers for 25, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. And particularly when we think about investments, when we think about KiwiSaver, when we think about home lending, these are all long-term relationships that involve multiple touch points over multiple years. And we have a great opportunity to really influence customers' lives for the positive and avoid bad things happening.
I guess for me, I feel like my personal challenge, and even within our own team and just as us as humans, is trying to remember to have a conversation about money is not a bad thing. We seem to have this weird cultural thing to talk about money is such a taboo subject. And the sheer amount of whakama or the shame around reaching out, asking for help, or even saying, I have a debt that I can't pay. I mean, to even have the conversation, that they'd rather not talk about it and suffer the consequences than to be able to have the conversation. And, and to me, I put that back on, the finance companies, the organizations that are doing the lending and stuff like that. It's about how approachable are we in being able to have those conversations, and what sort of response are we getting? And especially during COVID and things like that to be able to reduce that real shame for asking for help. And I think it starts with all of us just being able to have normal conversations about money on a regular basis with our kids, with our neighbors, with our friends. And it doesn't necessarily mean, going down to every detail, but it's even having a conversation of going, oh, no, I can't go out for dinner tomorrow night because actually, I don't get paid until next week. Just reducing some of those conversations and stigma, which then helps being able to have these whole conversations. And I'd also like to see more information in different languages. We're a multicultural society within New Zealand, and that's what we see a lot with our clients, is that English is not their first language. To see more of these contracts, more of these type of things offered in different languages, so that there isn't that a possibility of abuse or vulnerability being taken advantage of.
All right, well, we might wrap things up on that note. I really want to thank each of you for sharing your perspectives on this topic today. It's been really, really insightful, and hopefully it'll offer a bit of help grow awareness on this topic, and also offer a bit of hope for people that may be experiencing economic harm or abuse, that there are places that they can go, and there is help and support there. So thank you so much again. It was great to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having the conversation.